Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. She is 70 years old. I need you to understand that before I tell you anything else. 70 years old in an era when most people did not live past 40. She has survived plagues, wars, assassinations, the murders of nearly everyone she loved. She has ruled kingdoms. She has commanded armies. She has outlived every single one of her enemies except one. And now she is naked, stripped completely bare in front of a jeering crowd of thousands. Soldiers, peasants, nobles, priests, all of them watching, all of them laughing, all of them staring at this 70-year-old woman's body while she stands in chains, waiting to discover how she is going to die. Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians. I'm here to uncover the stories that history tried to bury, the truths hidden beneath centuries of propaganda and lies. Today, we're traveling back to the year 613, to a field outside the city of Reenacted, in what is now eastern France. The woman standing naked in that field is Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia, one of the most powerful rulers in European history, a woman who shaped the politics of an entire continent for nearly half a century. What they are about to do to her will take 3 days. 3 days of systematic humiliation designed not just to kill her, but to destroy everything she represented. 3 days that the chroniclers of the time recorded in detail because they wanted future generations to know what happens to women who accumulate too much power. 3 days that we at Crimson Legacy Historians are going to examine right now, because what happened to Brunhilde reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature that we still have not reckoned with. But here is what I need you to understand. First, Brunhilde was not a villain. She was not a monster. The crimes she was accused of, the murders, conspiracies, and dark deeds that her enemies attributed to her, most of them were invented after her death to justify what was done to her. The real story is far more complicated, far more tragic, and far more relevant to our world today than you might expect. Because what happened to Brunhilde was not justice, it was revenge. It was the final act in a blood feud that had consumed 2 families for 46 years. It was what happens when powerful men decide that a powerful woman has lived too long, accumulated too much influence, and needs to be made an example of. And the way they chose to make that example is something I have never been able to forget since I first learned about it. Stay with Crimson Legacy Historians, because I am going to tell you the whole story. Not just what they did to her at the end, but how she got there, who she was, what she built, what she lost, and why her final hours were designed to be the most degrading public spectacle that anyone in 6th century Europe had ever witnessed. This is the story of Queen Brunhilde. And I promise you, once you know what I am about to tell you, you will never forget her either. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you cannot understand what happened to Brunhilde at the end, without understanding who she was at the start. She was born around 543 in the Visigothic kingdom, which covered most of what is now Spain and southern France. Her father was King Athanagild, which made her a princess from birth. But being a princess in the 6th century did not mean fairy tales and ball gowns. It meant you were a political asset to be married off to whoever would bring your family the most advantage. When Brunhilde was about 23 years old, her father arranged her marriage to Sigebert I, King of Austrasia. Austrasia was one of the Frankish kingdoms that had emerged from the collapse of the Roman Empire, covering roughly what is now northeastern France, Belgium, and western Germany. It was a wealthy kingdom, a powerful kingdom, and Sigebert was considered a good match. But here is the first thing you need to understand about Brunhilde. She was not just beautiful, she was brilliant. The chronicles describe her as exceptionally educated, fluent in multiple languages, deeply versed in Roman law and administration. At a time when most royalty could barely read, Brunhilde was a scholar, and she was about to enter a world that had no idea what to do with a woman like her. She married Sigebert in 567. By all accounts, it was a genuine love match, not just a political arrangement. Sigebert was reportedly captivated by her intelligence and her beauty. They had children together. They ruled together. For a brief moment, Brunhilde had everything, and then her sister was murdered. Brunhilde's younger sister, Galswintha, had been married to Sigebert's brother, King Chilperic of Neustria. It was supposed to be another advantageous match, another alliance between kingdoms. But Chilperic had a mistress, a former servant named Fredegund, and Fredegund did not appreciate being set aside for a foreign princess. Within a year of the wedding, Galswintha was found strangled in her bed. Everyone knew who was responsible. Fredegund made no real effort to hide her involvement, and Chilperic, rather than punishing his mistress, married her, made her his queen, rewarded her for murdering Brunhilde's sister. I want you to imagine what that felt like. Your baby sister sent to a foreign kingdom to marry a man who turned out to be a monster, murdered in her own bed by a servant who wanted her position. And the man responsible not only faced no consequences, but elevated the murderer to royalty. This is where the blood feud began. This is the wound that would never heal. For the next 46 years, Brunhilde and Fredegund would be locked in a war that would consume their families, their kingdoms, and ultimately their lives. And here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we need to tell you something about Fredegund before we go any further, because understanding her is essential to understanding what eventually happened to Brunhilde. Fredegund was everything Brunhilde was not. Where Brunhilde was educated and noble-born, Fredegund had risen from nothing through manipulation, seduction, and murder. Where Brunhilde operated through law and administration, Fredegund operated through poison and assassination. The chronicles of the time described Fredegund as perhaps the most ruthless woman in Frankish history, responsible for ordering the deaths of bishops, nobles, and even members of her own family when they became inconvenient. These two women hated each other with an intensity that is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. This was not a political rivalry. This was personal. This was blood demanding blood. And for nearly 5 decades, that hatred would shape the destiny of Western Europe. But here is what we at Crimson Legacy Historians need you to understand. When the chroniclers wrote about these events, they were almost all men. Men who served the kings who eventually won. Men who had every reason to portray Brunhilde as a villain and Fredegund as merely a loyal wife defending her husband. The narrative that has come down to us is a narrative written by the people who destroyed Brunhilde, and we need to read it with that understanding. Because the Brunhilde who emerges from the more neutral sources, the administrative records, the legal documents, the building inscriptions, is very different from the monster her enemies described. That Brunhilde was a builder, a reformer, a ruler who maintained Roman roads and aqueducts, who patronized churches and monasteries, who tried to bring order and civilization to kingdoms that were sliding into chaos. That Brunhilde was a woman who did what she had to do to survive in a world that gave women almost no power, and who used what power she had to accomplish things that men would be celebrated for. But that is not the Brunhilde that history chose to remember. History chose to remember the version her enemies created, and what they did to her at the end was designed to make sure that their version would be the only one anyone would ever know. The wars between Brunhilde and Fredegund lasted for decades. Battles were fought, territories changed hands, children and grandchildren were drawn into a conflict that had started before most of them were born. Brunhilde's husband, Sigebert, was assassinated in 575, murdered by agents sent by Fredegund. Brunhilde was captured briefly but managed to escape. She remarried, was widowed again, and eventually became regent for her son Childebert II. This is where Brunhilde showed what she was truly capable of. As regent, she did not simply hold power until her son came of age. She wielded it. She formed alliances. She reformed the administration of her kingdom. She built infrastructure. She maintained the postal system that the Romans had created. She patronized the church and used it to extend her influence. She did everything that a king would have done, and in many cases did it better. The problem was that she was not a king, she was a queen, and queen regents were supposed to step aside when their sons grew up. Brunhilde did not step aside. Even after Childebert came of age, even after he married and had children of his own, Brunhilde remained the dominant force in Austrasian politics. When Childebert died in 596, Brunhilde became regent again, this time for her grandsons, Theudebert and Theuderic. 2 kings now, 2 kingdoms, and 1 grandmother controlling both. This was unprecedented. This was dangerous. And this was when the nobility of Austrasia and Burgundy began to truly fear her. You have to understand, the Frankish nobility had power because the kings were weak. They had carved out their own territories, their own privileges, their own semi-independent domains. A strong king threatened all of that. And Brunhilde was not just a strong king. She was an intelligent one who understood Roman law and administration, one who might actually succeed in centralizing power in ways that would destroy their autonomy forever. They could not simply depose her. She had the loyalty of the church. She had the loyalty of much of the common people. She had decades of experience and a network of alliances that made her dangerous to challenge directly. So they waited. They plotted. They spread rumors about her. They whispered that she was responsible for every death, every misfortune, every setback that befell the kingdom. They called her a witch. They called her a murderer. They called her things that I cannot repeat here, but that you can imagine. And they waited for their opportunity. Meanwhile, Fredegund died. In 597, Brunhilde's great enemy finally passed away, apparently of natural causes. After 46 years of war, Brunhilde had outlived her. But Fredegund had a son, Clothar II, and he had inherited not just his mother's kingdom, but her hatred. The blood feud was not over. It had simply passed to the next generation. Clothar was patient, he was cunning, and he understood something that Brunhilde perhaps did not fully appreciate. The Austrasian nobility did not just dislike Brunhilde, they feared her, and fear can be turned into action if you offer people the right incentive. In 613 the trap was finally sprung. Brunhilde's own nobles betrayed her. They invited Clothar to invade. They opened their gates to his armies. They handed over their queen, the woman who had ruled them for decades, to her greatest enemy. She was 70 years old. She had survived everything the world had thrown at her. She had outlived husbands, children, grandchildren. She had navigated the most dangerous political landscape in Europe for nearly half a century. And now she was in the hands of a man whose she had been at war with for his entire life. A man who had spent years listening to stories about how Brunhilde had murdered his relatives, destroyed his family, brought ruin to his people. A man who wanted revenge, not just for himself, but for a mother who had died hating Brunhilde with her final breath. What happened next would become the most notorious execution in early medieval history. I need to prepare you for what I am about to describe, because the details of what was done to Brunhilde are disturbing. They were meant to be disturbing. The entire point was to create a spectacle of suffering so extreme that no woman would ever again dare to accumulate the kind of power that Brunhilde had held. The torture lasted 3 days. 3 days during which Brunhilde was subjected to every humiliation that Clothar and his advisors could devise. And the records are clear that this was not random cruelty. Every element was chosen deliberately to maximize her degradation. On the first day she was stripped. A 70-year-old woman, a queen who had worn the finest garments in Europe, who had received ambassadors and commanded armies, was stripped naked in front of the assembled crowd. Her clothes were torn from her body while soldiers held her in place, and then she was made to stand there, exposed, while people looked and pointed and laughed. This was not just cruelty, this was theatre. In the 6th century, a queen's body was supposed to be sacred, hidden, covered in rich fabrics that signified her status. To expose that body was to strip away everything she represented, to force people to see her not as a ruler, but as just flesh. Old flesh, vulnerable flesh. The sources describe her standing with what dignity she could manage while the crowd jeered. They threw things at her, they shouted insults, and she stood there, because what else could she do on the second day she was paraded? They put her on a camel, not a horse, which would have had some dignity. A camel. In Frankish territory, camels were exotic, foreign, associated with the strange peoples of the East. Putting Brunhilde on a camel was a way of saying she was not really one of them. She was other. She was foreign. She was a Visigothic outsider who had presumed to rule Frankish kingdoms for 50 years. They led the camel through crowds of people, through villages and towns, through places where Brunhilde had once been greeted with ceremony and reverence. Now she was paraded as a captured enemy, still naked, still exposed, mounted on an animal that made her look ridiculous. The chronicles describe people coming from miles around to see the spectacle, to see the great queen brought low, to see this woman who had terrified their lords reduced to a naked old woman on a camel. And through all of this, she was alive. She was conscious. She knew what was happening. She felt every moment of it. I cannot imagine what those 2 days were like for her. The physical suffering would have been immense. No food or little food, no water or little water. exposed to the elements, 70 years old, and subjected to treatment that would break a young person in peak health. But the psychological suffering must have been worse. Every face in those crowds was someone who knew who she was. Many of them had served her. Many of them had benefited from her rule, and now they were laughing at her naked body, throwing garbage at her, shouting obscenities. Everything she had built, everything she had accomplished, everything she had survived, none of it mattered now. She was just a spectacle, an object lesson, a warning, and she still had one more day to endure. On the third day, they killed her, but not quickly, not mercifully. The execution method that Clothar chose was designed to ensure that Brunhilde's death would be as prolonged, as painful, and as degrading as her life's final days had been. They tied her to a horse, not placed her on a horse, but tied her to one. The accounts differ on exactly how this was done. Some say her hair was tied to the horse's tail. Some say her arms and legs were bound to 4 different horses. The most common account says that she was tied by one arm, one leg, and her hair to the tail of a wild horse. And then they released the horse. I am not going to describe what happened next in detail because you can imagine it. A wild horse, terrified, bolting across a field, dragging a 70-year-old woman behind it. The impact, the tearing, the gradual destruction of a human body as it was pulled across rough ground at speed. The sources say it took time. They say she did not die immediately. They say the horse ran and ran while Brunhilde was still alive, still conscious, still feeling everything. And then, when it was finally over, when the horse had tired and Brunhilde's body was no longer recognizable as human, they burned what was left. There would be no tomb for Brunhilde, no monument, no place where people could come to remember her. The message was clear: this woman was to be erased, not just killed, but obliterated, removed from existence so thoroughly that nothing would remain except the memory of her suffering. That was the point. The suffering was the message. Every element of her execution, from the stripping to the camel to the horse, was designed to ensure that her death would be remembered for centuries, that women who might be tempted to accumulate power would remember what happened to women who overreached, that the lesson would be carved into history so deeply that it could never be forgotten. And it worked. Here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we need to address something that the medieval sources mention, but that modern accounts often leave out because it is too disturbing. The humiliation of Brunhilde was not just about her body, it was about her womanhood specifically, the things that were done to her, the stripping, the exposure, the parading. These were not random cruelties, they were gendered cruelties. They were designed specifically to humiliate a woman in ways that a man would not have been humiliated. When male rulers were executed, they were typically killed quickly, beheaded, stabbed, strangled. There might be public display of the body afterward, but the execution itself was usually efficient. Male rulers were killed to remove them from power. Their deaths were political acts. What was done to Brunhilde was different. The 3 days of public degradation, the exposure of her naked body, the camel ride that was specifically designed to make her look ridiculous. These were not just about killing her, they were about punishing her for being a woman who had accumulated male power. The message was clear: women who rule like men will be humiliated like women. The things that could only be done to women, the exposure, the degradation, a reduction to a body to be looked at and mocked, these were the things that would be done to women who forgot their place. I think about the women who watched this, because there were women in those crowds. Women who saw what happened to Brunhilde and understood what it meant. Women who learned the lesson that Clothar intended them to learn. For generations afterward, women in Frankish territories would remember what happened to the queen, who ruled too long and too well, and they would remember what the cost of power was for a woman, and many of them would decide that the cost was too high. This is what Clothar really accomplished, not just the death of one woman, but the suppression of countless women who might have been capable of ruling, who might have been capable of greatness, but who looked at what happened to Brunhilde and decided to stay in their prescribed roles. The most successful acts of oppression are the ones that do not need to be repeated. You make one example so horrifying, so public, so unforgettable that people police themselves. They do not need to be threatened because they have already seen what happens. Brunhilde's execution was that kind of example. It echoed forward through centuries, teaching women what would happen if they overreached, and the lesson was learned so well that it did not need to be taught again for a very long time. Let me tell you about the aftermath. about what happened after the horse stopped running and the fire finished burning. Clothar II became the sole ruler of all the Frankish kingdoms. For the first time in decades, there was no rival king, no regent queen, no divided inheritance. He had achieved what his mother Fredegund had spent her entire life trying to achieve, total victory over the family of Brunhilde. He was celebrated as a great unifier, the man who had brought peace to the Frankish lands, the man who had ended the civil wars. And he was careful to ensure that his version of history was the one that survived. His chroniclers wrote accounts of Brunhilde that portrayed her as a monster. They attributed every death, every misfortune, every setback of the previous 50 years to her machinations. They made her into a witch, a poisoner, a murderer who had killed 10 kings. These accounts became the official history. They were copied and recopied in monasteries across Europe. When later historians wrote about this period, they drew on these accounts. And so the lie was perpetuated across centuries. But there were cracks in the narrative. There were other sources, administrative, records, building inscriptions, letters, that told a different story. These sources showed a Brunhilde who built roads and bridges, who maintained Roman infrastructure, who patronized churches and monasteries, who corresponded with the Pope about matters of theology and governance. These sources showed a Brunhilde who was capable, intelligent, and effective, a ruler who did what rulers do, sometimes ruthlessly, but no more ruthlessly than the male rulers who were praised for the same actions. It took over 1,000 years for historians to begin piecing together this other Brunhilde, the Brunhilde who was not a monster, but a woman doing her best in impossible circumstances, the Brunhilde who was destroyed not because she was evil, but because she was effective. And when you see that Brunhilde, the 3 days of torture look very different. They look like what they were, the punishment of competence, the destruction of a woman who had proven that women could rule, the message sent to every woman who might come after her that the same fate awaited anyone who dared to do what Brunhilde had done. We at Crimson Legacy historians want to talk about Fredegund for a moment, because her fate is instructive when compared to Brunhilde's. Fredegund, by any objective measure, was more ruthless than Brunhilde. She ordered assassinations. She poisoned rivals. She arranged the murder of her own stepchildren. The chronicles, even the ones written by people sympathetic to her, describe her as frighteningly violent and utterly immoral. And how did Fredegund die? In her bed, of natural causes. At a reasonably old age, she was never publicly humiliated. She was never stripped naked in front of crowds. She was never tied to a wild horse. She died as a queen, with her power intact, and was buried with honor. Why? Because Fredegund understood something that Brunhilde perhaps did not. She understood that a woman could be as violent as she wanted as long as she exercised that violence in service to male power. Fredegund killed people, many people, but she killed them to advance her husband's interests and then her son's interests. She was content to be the power behind the throne rather than the power on it. Brunhilde was different. Brunhilde ruled openly. She did not pretend to be acting for her husband or her son or her grandson. She ruled as herself. She made decisions. She issued orders. She was the king in all but name, and for that she had to be destroyed, not just killed but humiliated, mad. An example, shown to the world as what happens to women who refuse to hide behind men. Fredegund understood the rules and played within them. She was rewarded with a peaceful death. Brunhilde broke the rules. She was punished with 3 days of torture followed by one of the most horrific executions ever recorded. The lesson is not subtle. You can be a woman with power, but only if you pretend that the power belongs to a man. You can shape kingdoms and make history, but only if you do it through fathers and husbands and sons. Step out from behind the curtain, rule in your own name, and this is what happens. There is something we, at Crimson Legacy historians, have not told you yet. Something that makes Brunhilde's story even more tragic. She had family at the end. She was not alone in the world. She had great-grandchildren, descendants of the children she had raised and buried. When Clothar captured Brunhilde, he did not just capture her. He captured her entire remaining family. Her great-grandchildren, children, and infants were in his power, and he killed them, not all at once. The sources suggest that some were killed immediately, others were allowed to live for a time, perhaps held as hostages, perhaps used as bargaining chips. But within a few years of Brunhilde's execution, every male descendant who might have had a claim to any of her kingdoms, was dead. Clothar was thorough. He had learned from history that survivors seek revenge. His own existence was proof of that. He was the son of Fredegund, carrying forward his mother's hatred into the next generation. He would not make the mistake of leaving anyone alive who might do the same to him. So the line of Brunhilde ended. Not just Brunhilde herself, but everyone connected to her. Everyone who might have preserved her memory differently. Everyone who might have challenged the narrative that Clothar's chroniclers created. This is what total victory looks like. Not just defeating your enemy, but erasing them. Killing not just the leader, but the family. Destroying not just the person, but the possibility of any alternative story. I think about those children, the great-grandchildren who were too young to understand what was happening, who died because of a blood feud that had started decades before they were born, who never had a chance to grow up and become anything because the weight of history crushed them before they could begin. Brunhilde's execution was a spectacle. The children's deaths were quiet, but they were part of the same project, the complete annihilation of everything Brunhilde had been. Here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we have been asking ourselves why we wanted to tell you this story, why it matters, what you should take from it. And I think the answer is this. Brunhilde's story is not ancient history. It is not something that happened so long ago and so far away that it has no relevance to our lives today. The dynamics that destroyed Brunhilde, the fear of powerful women, the narratives constructed to justify atrocity, the examples made to keep people in their place, these dynamics are still with us. We still live in a world where women who accumulate power are treated differently than men who accumulate the same power, where the same actions that make men decisive make women difficult, where women in authority face criticism and scrutiny that men in the same positions do not face. We still live in a world where narratives are constructed to justify punishment, where people are turned into monsters in stories before they are destroyed in reality, where the crowd is taught to hate before it is asked to participate. We still live in a world where examples are made, where people are destroyed publicly and spectacularly to send messages to everyone who might think of following in their footsteps, where oppression works not just through direct violence, but through the fear of violence, the memory of what happened to the last person who stepped out of line. Brunhilde died over 1,400 years ago, but the forces that killed her are not dead. They have taken different forms, expressed themselves through different means, targeted different people, but they are still here. And we at Crimson Legacy Historians think we owe it to Brunhilde, and to the countless other people who have been made examples of throughout history, to recognize those forces when we see them, to question the narratives that justify atrocity, to refuse to be the crowd that laughs at a naked old woman while telling ourselves she deserves it. The people who watched Brunhilde die thought they were on the right side. They had been told a story, and they believed it. They participated in horror because they thought they were participating in justice. We have the benefit of distance. We can see that the story was a lie. We can see that what was done to Brunhilde was not justice, but murder dressed up in the clothes of justice. But we do not always have the benefit of distance. Sometimes the stories are being told about people in our own time. Sometimes we are being asked to participate in horror, while being assured that it is justified. Sometimes we are the crowd. What do we do then? I think we ask ourselves whether we would have laughed at Brunhilde, whether we would have believed the stories, whether we would have participated. And if the answer makes us uncomfortable, maybe that discomfort can motivate us to be more careful, to question the narratives we are told, to refuse to participate in making examples of people until we are sure, absolutely sure, that we are not being manipulated into cruelty. Because 1,400 years from now, someone might be telling our story, and I would like to think that when they do, we will not be the crowd that laughed while an old woman was dragged to her death. We at Crimson Legacy Historians want to tell you one more thing about Brunhilde, one detail that the sources preserve, though they may not have understood its significance. When she was brought before Clothar for the final time, before the torture began, he demanded that she confess to murdering the 10 kings, confess to the crimes that justified what he was about to do, give him the narrative he needed to make her execution look like justice. She refused, an old woman facing the most powerful man in Western Europe, knowing that she was about to die, knowing that nothing she said would change her fate. She refused to give him the confession he wanted. The sources present this as stubbornness, as evidence of her wickedness. She would not even admit her crimes, but I see it differently. I see a woman who understood that the confession was not really about her. It was about history. Clothar wanted her words on record, her own admission that she deserved what was about to happen. He wanted to be able to point to her confession for the rest of his life, and for all the years after his death, and say, "See, she admitted it. She was guilty. What I did was right." She would not give him that. She could not stop him from killing her. She could not stop him from torturing her, from humiliating her, from destroying her family and erasing her legacy. But she could refuse to participate in her own condemnation. She could refuse to speak the words that would make his narrative complete. It was a small act of resistance, the only act of resistance still available to her, and she took it. I think about that a lot, about the courage it must have taken to refuse, about the knowledge that her refusal would probably make her suffering worse, because Clothar would be angry, because torture is often used to extract confessions, and he would have every reason to escalate. She refused anyway, and because she refused, there is a crack in the narrative, a place where the official story does not quite fit together. If she was so obviously guilty, why did she not confess? If the crimes were so clear, why did she deny them to the end? That crack has allowed historians centuries later to begin questioning the whole story, to wonder if perhaps the narrative was not as solid as it seemed, to investigate and discover the other Brunhilde, the builder, the administrator, the capable ruler who was destroyed not for her crimes, but for her capabilities. Brunhilde's refusal to confess may have been the most important thing she did in those final days, more important than any words she could have spoken, because her silence left room for doubt. And doubt, given enough time, can unravel even the most carefully constructed lies. I am coming to the end of what we at Crimson Legacy historians want to tell you. But there is one more thing. After the fire finished burning, after Clothar's men had made sure that nothing recognizable remained of Brunhilde, after the crowds had dispersed and the spectacle was over, life went on. Clothar ruled for another 15 years. He was generally considered a successful king. He maintained order, he kept the peace, he did the things that kings are supposed to do, and then he died, and his kingdom was divided among his sons. And the cycle of civil wars and disputed successions resumed, exactly as it had before Brunhilde, exactly as it would continue for centuries after her. Everything that Clothar claimed to be ending by destroying Brunhilde, the instability, the violence, the competing claims to power, none of it actually ended. The problems were structural. They had nothing to do with one woman, no matter how capable she was. Killing Brunhilde did not fix anything, but it did send a message, and that message lasted. For generations, women in Frankish territories were careful not to accumulate too much visible power. They worked through husbands and sons, behind curtains and closed doors. They remembered what happened to the woman who had ruled openly. So in a sense, Clothar won. Not the political victory he claimed, the unification of the kingdoms, the end of civil strife. That was temporary. What lasted was the other victory, the suppression of women who might have been leaders, the enforcement of a rule that said women could have power only if they pretended they did not. That victory lasted for a very long time, long after Clothar was forgotten. Long after the kingdoms he ruled had fragmented and reformed a dozen times over, the lesson of Brunhilde endured. It endured until people started questioning it, until historians began to look past the official narratives and see the woman behind the monster, until the story started to be told differently. And now you know the story. You know what was done to Brunhilde and why. You know that the narrative of her wickedness was constructed to justify her destruction. You know that she was a capable ruler who was punished for ruling while female. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. But here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we hope you will remember her, not as the monster of the medieval chronicles, not as the wicked queen who got what she deserved, but as a woman who built things and tried to maintain civilization and was destroyed in the most brutal way possible because she was too good at a job that was not supposed to be hers. Remember her standing in that field, 70 years old, stripped naked, facing the crowd that had come to watch her die. Remember that she did not confess. Remember that she stood there with whatever dignity she could manage while the world laughed at her. Remember that she was not a monster, she was a woman, and what happened to her was monstrous. That is the truth that Clothar tried to bury. That is the truth that his chroniclers tried to hide. That is the truth that you now know. Do not let it be forgotten again. If you have stayed with Crimson Legacy historians this long, I want to thank you. This was not an easy story to tell, and I imagine it was not an easy story to hear, but I think it was an important one, because Brunhilde deserves to be remembered accurately after 1400 years of being remembered falsely, because the dynamics that destroyed her are not safely in the past, because we all need to be reminded sometimes that the crowd is not always right, that official narratives are not always true, that examples are made of people to keep the rest of us in line. I do not know if anything I have said will change how you see the world. I hope it will. I hope that the next time you hear a story about someone being punished, someone being made an example of, someone being destroyed publicly and spectacularly, you will pause. You will ask yourself whether you are hearing the truth or a narrative constructed to justify what was done. You will wonder if you are being invited to join a crowd, and what that crowd is really participating in. Brunhilde could not save herself. By the time she was captured, her fate was sealed. Nothing she could have done would have changed what was about to happen. But we can save her memory. We can tell her story accurately. Even after 1,400 years of lies, we can refuse to let the narrative that Clothar created be the final word. And maybe by remembering Brunhilde truly, we can make it a little bit harder for the next Clothar to create the next false narrative. A little bit harder for the next crowd to participate in the next atrocity, while believing they are witnessing justice. That is what we hope anyway. That is why we at Crimson Legacy Historians told you this story. If this meant something to you, if you think this story deserves to be told and shared, we would be grateful if you would subscribe to Crimson Legacy. Why historians? There are more stories like this one, more histories that have been buried under official narratives, more truths that deserve to be remembered. And if you have thoughts about what we have shared, questions, reactions, things you want us to know, leave them in the comments. We read them. They matter to us, and sometimes they shape what we choose to uncover next. The story of Brunhilde is over, but the conversation does not have to be. Thank you for being part of Crimson Legacy Historians.